for Neural Therapeutics. On the line with me are John Durfee and Ian Campbell. John, the chairman, Ian, the CEO. A lot of you have attended prior webinars that we hosted, so I won't go into too much detail. Just to point out that Ian is a very accomplished executive with many years of senior leadership experience in medical and other fields. He was responsible for launching a number of medical devices and clinical testing devices with the FDA and other people. John himself is more of a capital markets person, has been involved in a variety of regulated and unregulated industries, was with OMERS and the Ontario Teacher Pensions Fund, very accomplished corporate executive who's been helping us in the transition from subsidiary to independent listed company. And that's what we'll be talking about today. We have completed the spin out. I'm not going to steal all of Ian's thunder, so I'll keep this short. We did a more in-depth session on the company previously, recording of which should be available. What we wanted to do today was provide a little bit of an update of everything that's happened in the general environment, which is very promising, as well as the advances we have made as a company. So I'm going to hand over the call to Ian in a second, and he's going to, like I said, do a little presentation, following which we can head into Q&A. So Ian, the floor is all yours. Thank you very much.
Mark. I'm just trying to index the slides. There we go. Okay. So, as Mark said, there is a presentation already available, previously recorded. This presentation has been updated and will be available on our website shortly after this meeting. And we're going through the disclaimer slides right now. And before we get into the meat of our company and what we're give a little bit of an update on what's going on in the marketplace, why psychedelics are gaining some significant momentum, and what are the signals. There's been 3 recent events that have occurred since our last meeting, and the 3 are basically the American Medical Association, the one who controls all the building codes and for the insurance companies and so forth, has already adopted codes that were put together by MAPS and another company, and that has now leads the pathway for psychedelic therapy for the billing and the insurance pathway. A very clear sign that the industry that's behind it, the medical industry that's behind it, is aware and also getting ready for it. A few years back, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, who are the most significant regulator in this industry, fast-tracked a few promising psychedelic drugs, those being MDMA and psilocybin, and that led the pathway to where we are today, basically with now a new wealth of psychedelics which are being investigated. But on top of that, very recently, they published a guideline for the clinical trials and use of psychedelics. So it's a very, very promising step. And then I think what is probably the most promising of all of this is that this past weekend on Canada Day, Australia did what they said they were going to do back in February, and that is that they went live with those 2 drugs, the 2 psychedelics that I just mentioned earlier, for prescription and therapeutic use. So doctors are now able to use them finally, and it's the first week of that. Coincidentally, maybe not with their version of the FDA. And when they made the announcement, the Australian government actually cited him as a resource that was a convincing resource as to why we should be doing that. So hats off to our advisor, David Nutt. Thank you for that work, because we believe that when the tide comes in, all boats float. So again, not to belabor our presentation, but just a few key points about what we're doing for those of you who might be new is that we're working with a cactus, we're working with plant-based materials, and we're focusing on a drug called mescaline. And mescaline belongs in a number of different cacti, but we're focusing on one that's called San Pedro from South America, and particularly originates in Peru. And it's been in use for almost 6,000 years now. 5,700 years is what's documented in the scientific literature, and it has been used safely. And for those reasons, we believe that it's very likely that there will be very little impotence towards a phase 1 or phase 2. In other words, we will most likely, working with this drug, it will pass, it'll sail through this. This is a very high indicator that all these years of safe use leads itself to a very promising pathway for a drug company. So we're focusing on the mescaline part that's extracted from the plant, and the non-mescaline part we will focus on a nutraceutical, and that's towards enhanced cardiometabolic disease control, for example. But the value of the company is determined primarily by its psychedelic pathway. So just to briefly reiterate, there's a peyote cactus on the left side, and there's a San Pedro cactus on the right. You might be familiar with peyote. Peyote is a cactus which is nearly extinct, and it's sacrament to indigenous people of North America. It is not a cactus that we thought we would ever go with. On the other hand, the San Pedro plant is one which has been basically exploited for a few hundred years now by native people and people of South America for the purpose of religious freedoms and also for the commercial purposes which they do today in trade and also tourism. So it's one which we feel very comfortable using. It's very fast growing, it's not nearly extinct, and one that we can cultivate. History of mescaline. Mescaline has been used for an extensive period of time. Please have a look at this slide if you're curious about it. Aldous Huxley wrote very famously about it in The Doors of Perception, but it's been used and studied for quite some time, and then there was a break in that. And it's a very, very interesting drug because it has a unique pathway and it has a unique promise. Some of the advantages of people who have been using naturally sourced mescaline were reported just last year in the Journal of Psychopharmacology. Nearly 70% of the population, says 67% here, responded with reduced anxiety and depression. We've also seen in other papers the reduced cardiometabolic effects in like diabetes control. In addition to that, working with a plant, you have to also look at the precedents for that and what other companies are doing what. We have a couple of examples here of companies that have already moved forward with, with plant-based extracts, and one being Epidiolex, which is a CBD extract for epilepsy control, and the other one which is actually going through trials, and it's a psilocybin extract. So there are benefits in the non-mescaline bearing part, and we believe in the entourage effect. In other words, that combining the different chemicals that belong to, or the compounds that are native inside these plants, actually work together better than they work alone. There's a very, very big market that we can tackle with this. ADHD, depression, anxiety, etc., are all up for grabs. And there is a number of mental ailments which can be addressed, which are already in the literature. There are significant hints at like alcohol use disorder or drug use disorder, or others too. So working forward with a psychedelic drug, we can probably attack multiple comorbidities that occur in various populations where one would be on say a fentanyl addiction or an opioid prescription addiction, and then also have other mental ailments that are associated with that. So in terms of historical use, we discussed that it's been used for a long time. When we did our literature research, we found very, very few cases of any events. In fact, we found that there was at most maybe one death in recorded human history. and nobody really know how that happened. So it's extremely safe. We believe it will go through that phase 1 without any issues. The use in therapy is very interesting because you can use it for extensive talk therapy because it has a long half-life, and then also use it as a maintenance drug, like for instance in microdosing, because of that long half-life. In terms of our near targeted objectives, they remain the same because we're still working towards the actual testing in humans. But this is what we're looking at a variety of different extracts and working with different contract research organizations, and then looking at potentially different cocktails of extracts. An update today we'll discuss later on, but just a prelude, we actually have a significant permit approved now, and we're working towards the pharmaceutical development side first, working towards the preclinical pathway, and then human studies. With the right partner, we will focus on developing a nutraceutical with the residual material. That's because we want to be responsible stewards of the plant, not create waste, but to create revenue. Company's now 3 years old. There's been a significant number of milestones. We've already covered these last time. Just shortly before I came on and the new direction was derived, we had a couple studies underway with a contract research organization, one called KGK and the other one from Imperial College, where David Nutt is today, Professor David Nutt. And then we focused on doing work in Peru because that's a supply chain area. That's where the highest concentrations of mescaline in San Pedro are reported in the literature. We did some work with a cactus company down there, basically a cultivator. We created a relationship with them ongoing. Spoke with the drug authorities down there called Digimid, essentially the Peruvian DEA. We're still in discussions with them, and then been working with the universities and creating intellectual property. We'll cover that on the next slide. We did a comprehensive study with Memorial University. It was an MBA group that did that work for us to look at what we could do with the nutraceutical. We discovered that we were on the right path, that there is a fragmented market there, that we can take a significant portion of the cactus-based nutraceutical market, and that would be a non-mescaline market play, OTC, over-the-counter drug. Again, we've lined up some other key partnerships, one which is with Folium Labs here, and the other two I'll discuss a little bit later, who can do formulation and contract research work with us. Some of the recent developments are that recently we were legally spun out, and we were spun out from the parent company that owned us for a couple of years. And that company is still on its pathway to be a recreational cannabis company. And as you see, we are a medical therapeutic company, so there's completely a divergence in our pathways. So we wish them well. We're now spun out completely independent. And on top of that transaction, we were able to take advantage of a situation where we were able to get DTC eligibility, which basically is a major milestone towards listing in both Canada and eventually listing in the US on a major exchange. That's our pathway. CERFOR very recently also provided us the permit to go and collect wild plant materials in Peru. This is a very unique permit to get. You have to have a national partner that you're working with, and we're doing that with the Cayetano University that you see next to that. And on top of that, we also had to pass a very high level of scientific rigor to make sure that we were doing a study of worth and that we would contribute to science and to their communities, all of which we're intending to do. So permit granted there. Then we have Cayetano University. The university we've been working with, creating the standard operating procedure for our chemical analysis of mescaline in the plant-based material, doing the DNA sequencing of the plants. We're looking at the entire or 3 major plant species within the genus. And we will be the first group of scientists to actually sequence this plant properly, the Peruviana version of San Pedro in particular. and we will publish that data. On top of that, we've been working with our intellectual property, gaining more evidence for our discussion with the patent lawyers as our patent pending case will come up in the near future, I hope. And we're optimizing that with the group that are called Caribbean Gold Laboratories, and they're on another slide a little further down. And on top of that, we are still expanding and doing measurements and working in the nursery on our cultivation experiment. We have a number of species that we're monitoring, and it's well underway there. You might remember last time we did a publication. This is a publication we did with the entire, well, the scientific team that includes Kelly Noreen and Jason Dyke and Joanna from Imperial College, and then of course David Nutt from Imperial College and myself. It was a very significant paper, a thorough review of mescaline, and the publishers came back to us because there was a big push for the issue to go live and free, and we of course acknowledge that, and now you can download this article for free and read it in your leisure time if you wish so. But it's a very thorough review of mescaline. I alluded to earlier the Caribbean Gold Standard Company. Now that's our partner based in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, but their parent company is Validity Labs in Florida. And those of you who follow us on LinkedIn will have maybe seen the story about my visit to the state capital of Florida. I think it was back in April when it was sponsored by Caribbean Gold and a nonprofit called Operation 300. And the reason why we did that was because we wanted to meet with a Senator Toby Overdorf, who is a Republican in a Republican-led House. And he's pushing for psychedelic therapy to benefit veterans and to expand research in the state of Florida. What's interesting, we learned, is that the state can do things that other states may not wish to do, and part of the legislation, which is already in draft, includes natural psychedelics like mescaline to be incorporated in that. So it's a very good thing to have happen. One of the reasons why we're there too, of course, is the human side. Getting veterans access to psychedelic therapy will mean a reduction in the rates of suicide and other unfortunate events that do occur. And then as an aside, the nonprofit organization that we were working with, Operation 300, and we still are in communication, have watched their population of families that they take care of grow from 5% to 45% in the classification of families which have unfortunately succumbed to suicide of a veteran in their family. So it's a very, very significant thing, and we saw bipartisan support throughout our meeting while we were there, and continue to do so. So looking forward to potentially getting some funding from the Florida state to expand our research with our partner, Caribbean Gold. And then we have Mayan Technologies down below. I mentioned those last time too. Again, this is a great Canadian company that have worked on wearable technologies, and wearable technologies, basically part of the future plan is to use this in our clinical studies, but also to map out the psychedelic experience to basically lower the barrier for medical practitioners to be able to prescribe materials in a safe way at a person's home where they're most comfortable. Because of those of you who follow the world of psychedelic therapy, set and setting is everything. Being relaxed, being comfortable, and being at home while you're getting therapy can be very, very productive. Our current and future milestones are still on track. We're still here. We are in 23. You know, we're finalizing the SOP for the DNA. That'll be very, very soon. The one for the chemistry is already done. Working and finding different contract research organizations. We're on track here, folks. Working towards our goals in 2023 to get into discussions with the FDA and to also get into preclinical and clinical trials. And Mark? Can I hand this over to you?
Sorry, everyone, I was on mute there for a second. Thank you, Ian. Yeah, I just wanted to talk about cap table, the raise and the use of funds. Interestingly, one of our investors put it very succinctly to me not that long ago. He said, when I look at companies, I look at three things. I look at the quality of the asset. I look at the quality of the management team. And for the management team, that goes both about their ability to manage the operations, but also to be good stewards of capital, because we've seen a lot, especially in these nascent industries, where management teams raised a lot of money and then started overspending. That is not going to be the case with this team. It's a very frugal team. It's also a very accomplished team, but we've gone over that already. The asset, which is mescaline, is great. Ian already explained that. Then the third item that this particular investor would look at, that most investors look at, is the cap table. What does the cap table look like? What you don't want to see is a huge amount of shares outstanding, and that's not the case here. Issued pre-money is only about 76 million. With warrants and RSUs and stuff like that, it goes up to 95 million. Still not a big number, but one thing to keep in mind is that warrants and options only become worth something, only are going to be seen in the market once the company or the company's valuation has surpassed those levels. So the fact that warrants might be exercised is not a bad thing, because A, it brings money to the company, and B, it means that the company is doing well and that its valuation is going up. So we've got a relatively tight cap table, and I'm just going to switch to the next slide. Ian, if you can move us on to the next slide. I want to talk a bit about pro forma ownership and use of funds. So what would the company look like following the fundraise? We're looking to raise up to 2.1 million. But with a minimum of around 1 million. We are in talks with the exchange, figuring out what exactly the amount of money is we need to effect listing. But that money is earmarked really to generate value. Part of that, will go to G&A. That's very important, because that basically means that we've got people in the company that can run the company properly. Beyond that, most of the money, though, will go into the research that we're doing. The research through which we will be hitting milestones, and those milestones each will represent additional accretional value to the company. We've already hit a number of milestones, and we continue on this path, so it's very good. Another thing about the cap table is that the company is fairly tightly held. Over 35% of current holders will actually be escrowed for 3 years upon listing. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. In the cannabis industry, in the psychedelics industry, we've seen a lot of companies that I would term as capital markets constructs. Basically a collection of assets that look sexy to the market, but with very little operational capability behind it. And typically what you see, those companies list, the management team cashes out, moves on to the next thing. That's definitely not the case here, and it's been formalized here that it's not the case, because people will be through a leak out of escrow over the next 3 years. So going back to what I said earlier, great asset, a nice cap table, very tightly held, managed by a strong and frugal team. Obviously, we're doing the current raise at a very compelling valuation. As you're probably all aware, that the capital markets are a little bit like the DVP during rush hour, but so not much happening. But that is changing, and we see sort of silver linings. Myself, I've been looking at the market for a long time. I believe that we hit a bit of an inflection point. We're seeing low liquidity, which is slowly creeping up, but what we're not seeing is massive selling, depressing valuations. It looks to me like people who are selling in the market right now are generally those who need to liquidate in order to, meet their normal committed outgoings. True investors looking for upside are not really cycling out of too many stocks, other those that are really, really bad. So to me, that means that we're at an inflection point, and I anticipate that, come September, come the time that this company is going to be publicly traded, I'm very hopeful and confident that we're going to see an upswing in the market, and that the liquidity is going to be chased. That's going to be in a number of sectors. And to me, because of the must-have nature of psychedelics, because of its much greater promised efficacy in treating these debilitating disorders that are causing individuals and society huge damage, this is a must-have sector that I think will take off. And on that, I'm going to hand it back to Ian.
Just to excuse me, just to reiterate, Mark, I'm sorry if I'm going to rehash what you mentioned, but I got a prompt that basically, you know, the pre-money share count of the company is 39 million, and 79 million is the post-money share count. So now with that, thank you, Mark. I'm going to just sort of dive back into a review of the team, and I'm very, very happy to have this team. Again, David Nutt, Professor David Nutt, who is actually a very big part of this entire industry. He was headline news this past week on the BBC, and he often is. A very, very generous man with his time. I speak to him at least once or twice a month, and have very in-depth conversations about our pathway forward in psychedelic research that's going on. Then we have Dr. Duc Phu, who is a chemist extraordinaire, great researcher, also great extraction expert. It was his team that helped us to create the intellectual property that we have, and we're moving forward with that. Then we have the new addition to our team, which is Dr. Mara. And Dr. Mara, she prefers to use her first name, is actually a physician based in Windsor, Ontario. So she actually has a practice. She's also an entrepreneur. She runs two entities that focus on medical marijuana use, and is involved in developing products in that space. She's treated over 8,000 patients, and on her website, she's had I think over 20,000 articles. Then we have Dr. Kelly Noreen with us, who is an expert in genetics and also in the pharmaceutical pathways. She has a deep experience in bringing plant-based materials to the market through their various cycles, and also a lot of regulatory experience. And then we have another professor, Dr. Jason Dyke from the University of Alberta. And again, he and Kelly have worked together for many years, but he's also been involved in many different plant-based materials. And all this team have significant focus on controlled substances research. This is a science-based company, and I'm very happy to have that team. And then turning over, you'll see some of the similar faces. We've incorporated a couple of the Jason and Kelly into the actual leadership team, the board. And then we have John Durfee and Colin. John, who is the chairman of the organization, as introduced by Mark previously with the CAP experience. Also a very, very fluent financial individual. And then we have our independent audit director, and that is Colin McClelland, who comes to us from a variety of different industries, and also is also very financially very fluent. So you not only have the best of both worlds in this team, folks. We have the scientific team. I'm included in that as a biogeochemist, and a very strong look at the finances and how we're going to deal with things. So